the use of scaffolding, the use of rewards, competition, and elements that enhance engagement that are used in games, and how these might be applied and transferred to learning and teaching. So it's about more than just playing games. It also does not need to be these high-end, graphically rich, and also usually really expensive gaming stroke simulations. They don't need to be first person, they don't need to be virtual worlds. There's an awful lot of games out there that aren't like that and are really effective. There is really little evidence that graphic fidelity has any impact on gameplay from the majority of game types. The exceptions to this might be games where immersion is important, such as first-person shooters or racing games, which, to be honest, aren't necessarily appropriate for learning anyway. And most of the examples of games with low production values that are effective. So, example, I don't know if anybody's come across Kingdom of Loathing, which is a online multi-user role-play game with stickmen. And again, it's all about the gameplay and the interaction, not about the fact that you're playing with stickmen. And a good example of one for learning is a game that was played at the University of Brighton called Who is Herring Hale, which was an alternate reality game that used its very limited graphical capabilities, but actually got people to do things in the real world with the fidelity of actual reality. So I'm definitely wanting it to move beyond the kind of high-end simulations. It doesn't just look at digital or online games. So traditional games such as board games, card games, have been commonly used to support face-to-face teaching for years, but they all seem to have got all the research and work that's been done on games. These type of games seems to have disappeared under the hype around new, exciting, immersive games. I've said before, new game forms like alternate reality games mash up the real world and the virtual world, and they're growing definitely in the UK in popularity in education. Again, people tend to think of games-based learning taking place in schools or training, but actually there's lots and lots of examples of much wider scope, from early childhood through to late adulthood, schools, colleges, universities, homes, workplaces, formal, informal. Again, what I'm just trying to highlight here is that scope is a lot wider than people might initially think. And finally, this is really just a chance for me to have a little rant, I suppose. Games-based learning is not about simulations and not about virtual worlds. Now, often, if you're into games, you'll go to lots of conferences and you'll see somebody who's put in a lecture theatre in Second Life and is calling it a game, or has used a simulation, which is a brilliant learning tool, but it's a simulation, it's not a game. And that's not to say that simulations or virtual worlds can't be part of games, but their use alone doesn't make them into games. So for me, the key aspects of game-based learning is this idea of structured playfulness. And I was pleased that play came up a couple of times, kind of fun came up. Now, I'm really not a fan. I noticed it was in my blurb, and I can't remember whether I wrote that in a moment of being in a panic or whether somebody else wrote it, but I really dislike the term serious games, because I think the use of the word serious actually misses the point of what's important about games, which is this idea of playfulness, that they provide a safe, playful, fantastic, as in relating to fantasy as opposed to amazing, playful space where you can experiment, explore, interact. And I would agree that in terms of that playfulness, you could include things like virtual worlds and simulations, but the important thing about games as well is that this idea of structured boundaries, so that there are goals, there are rules, there are outcomes, and there are rewards. And it's those two things together that I think create game-based learning. Thanks, Chad. It's quite weird. I'm talking and not getting any feedback. So if anybody else wants to make any points as I'm talking, that would be really appreciated. And I agree with Lindy as well. You can build games inside virtual worlds, but that doesn't mean that the one that springs to mind is a talk I went to on game-based learning in Second Life, and they built a lecture theatre. And you went in and you sat and you watched the lecture theatre. And lecture theatres aren't particularly effective in real life, so reproducing them in a world where you can fly just seems to be really strange. But I've got my rant over, so I'm going to move on to the next slide now. Brilliant, at least I think I am. So, quick slide about games and learning. So, why use games for learning? What can they offer us? Now, for me, the first argument has to be the pedagogic one. Now, I know a lot of papers on games and learning will start by saying games for learning are great because they motivate people. Actually, when you dig down and look at the research evidence around that, no, they only motivate some people, some types of games, some of the time. So using that as a sole argument for using games really isn't a terribly good one. But if you start looking at the pedagogy, then I really think that good games are about learning. That is, the principles that good, engaging, fun games employ also, by their very nature, make good learning experiences. So they're about doing things, about being interactive rather than passive. They're about taking part in a concrete experience and actually seeing what happens when you do something and getting feedback that's intrinsic to the game. There's the potential for hypothesis building, testing, and experimentation. Is that a hand? Okay, I'm going to finish just this little bit here, and then I'll come back to the hand. They offer the potential for learning collaboratively, so on virtual online worlds, or taking turns around a console, simply engaging in player communities, or even just two people working together to solve an adventure game. And they also offer authentic and meaningful context for problem solving, creative solution finding. Okay, can I go to Amanda?
Yeah, hi. I basically am reflecting on this, and I'm thinking that that's one of the reasons why people confuse, say, a virtual reality like Second Life, and they're mixing it up with the games that you might do for another type, which is not so. Yeah, because you've got the experiential part immediately tie in experience with simulation. I mean, what do you think?
I agree. I think when you look at the playfulness, now you can have playfulness need a simulation or something like Second Life and experience an experimentation, but whether it's playful or not, I think depends very much on how it's actually used. But what you don't get is the structure, and I think this idea of structure, of having rules and boundaries and goals and rewards, and is absolutely crucial to games. And I can see that there is overlap in terms of that they look the same. And for people that don't necessarily play games a great deal, there might not be a lot graphically between Second Life and between Lara Croft and Tomb Raider. I mean, they're all about people in a 3D world. And I think that's where some of the confusion comes from. Does that answer your question, or do you want to make a comment back?
Oh, yeah, no, that answered my question just fine. I was just making a comment and a link.
Oops, I'm pressing the wrong button. I said I've now been managing to mute myself when I meaning to put myself on this technology. So going back to games and learning, so as well as I think there's a really, really strong link between good game design and good learning design. To the point, actually, where if you knew nothing about games and you designed a really good session, then it might end up actually looking like something like a game and being as engaging as a game. So I get a bit troubled by this idea about using games to make them engaging, because actually it's about good learning design. Games are interactive and they offer intrinsic feedback, which allows players to test ideas, learn from their mistakes. And this mistake making, I think, is a really important feature of games. They provide different levels of challenge, from the novice player to the expert, so this idea of scaffolding, gradually offering more difficult tasks as players become more experienced. Again, something that we aim for in teaching and learning, and yet games seem to do fairly effortlessly. They provide this idea of a safe environment for playful practice, away from the consequences of the real world. And then there are characteristics that support engagement, such as narrative, competition. Again, support engagement for some people. Some people will look at something competitive and be really put off with it. So I think we have to be very careful about using elements like this. But to recognise that for some people, although certainly not everybody, these sort of elements can be motivational, they can be engaging. Okay, and I'm going to move on again. Okay, so hopefully you were a little bit convinced at this point, even though I've kind of gone over it very quickly, about why games might have potential in terms of education. I think when we're talking about assessment, which is what I'm going to go on to talk about in a bit more detail now,